Today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to clean your two-cycle diaphragm style carburetor. These carburetors are commonly found on gasoline chainsaws, line trimmers, leaf blowers, weed eaters, whatever you want to call them, and some other kinds of just lawn equipment and small engine equipment. They call them like a cube style carburetor, that's another name for them, but I just call them diaphragm style. This here particular one happens to have the primer bulb on the one side of the carburetor. Some, if you guys are watching this, your type of equipment might have the primer bulb in a separate location on the piece of equipment, and this might just be a metal cover that's not having a primer bulb at all, which is, it's the same principles, just the primer bulb is in a different location and there's an extra fuel line or two in the mix. So if you guys are wondering how to clean this carburetor, this is the video for you. Gonna kind of go through some basic stuff, what could be some symptoms of a dirty carburetor, and what are the first things that I always clean. This is a brand new carburetor, by the way, guys. I just had this sitting around, and obviously yours might be in a lot worse condition. This one is a brand new one. It has the adjustment screws with the splined outer edges, which takes a special set of screwdrivers. I'll leave a link in the description to a screwdriver kit in case your carburetor has these type of adjustment screws. Some of them have flatheads, some of them have D-shape or a Pac-Man symbol. They have splined ones like these, but I'll give you guys a link in the description to a kit of screwdrivers that is going to help you when doing the adjustments. So a lot of times these carburetors, the diaphragms get stiff in them, or some, using bad fuel like varnish or ethanol, that stuff builds up inside here, and the diaphragms, and there's a little bitty screen inside the fuel inlet screen, and that can clog up pretty easily too. That's it usually won't even start at all if the screen is clogged, because it won't get any fuel, but I'll show you guys that screen in just a little bit here. Another thing is, sometimes it'll idle, and as soon as you hit the gas, it just bogs, burr, burr, burr. You're hitting the throttle, and it just bogs. It'll idle just fine, but it bogs out. A lot of times, guys, that's just a simple adjustment of the low speed screw. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but there's a little L on, usually it's stamped in the carburetor, but if you guys don't have a stamping, it's usually the one that's closest to the engine. So this would be the throttle plate side, closest to the engine. The low speed screw is going to be the one closest to the engine. And a lot of times you guys can take that low speed screw, turn it out a quarter of a turn, and all of a sudden that bog goes away because you're giving it just a tick more fuel so it can transition into the high-speed circuit. So that's just quick things you guys can do if you have that symptom of that bog. A lot of times when it's bogging, it just has dirt in some kind of passageway in the carburetor, bad fuel, just something has clogged up the circuit in the carburetor causing it to bog. And same thing at high speed too, you can do the same exact thing. You might just have to give it a little bit more fuel or a little bit less fuel. Usually on two-cycle stuff, the leaner you go, the higher it's going to rev. And you guys got to be very careful when you're doing that, because you always want to use a tachometer when you're setting the high speed. You don't want to over-rev the engine for that type of equipment. Typically, like a reference point that I would do for saws, 12,500 RPM on the high speed is a typical safe RPM range to run. Blowers and trimmers, probably around the 9,500 range, 9,000 RPM. I wouldn't probably push it any higher than that. So just a quick reference. That's not like a perfect correct way in a service manual. That's just my estimated RPM that I've been setting my stuff to, and that's pretty close to what all the service manuals are going to tell you. But yeah, I'm going to get the primer side cover off, show you guys what's behind it, and tell you a little bit about what goes on in there, what kind of clogs up, and kind of how to clean it. So I'm going to get to that right. Let's get combo off. This is going to be the, I think it's the metering side, because it meters the amount of fuel in. It has the little needle valve, float needle, whatever you want to call it. Here's your diaphragm and gasket. You guys can see that metal centerpiece pushes on this little float arm right here. And there's different settings for different carburetor manufacturers and how to set that. You might have to watch a different YouTube video or look it up online to properly set that. So also, if you guys ever take these apart, there's actually a different orientation on each side of the carburetor where the gasket and the diaphragm go, and which one goes on first. So kind of pay attention if you guys take them apart individually, how they went, because that's kind of important when you put it back together. But make sure when you're checking these out that it's not stiff, and stuck. This one here is obviously brand new, so it's nice and pliable. It might not be a bad idea if you guys are doing this for yourself on your own piece of equipment. It wouldn't be a bad idea to get the diaphragm kit because they're dirt cheap, but if you're actually going to be doing this for a customer, I would recommend just buying a whole entire carburetor because they're so cheap already. But if you guys are trying to learn about them and you're doing it as like a homeowner project or on your own piece of equipment, then it's fine to buy a diaphragm kit and try to clean it out yourself. So here, all these little holes, you guys can see those little ones. You're going to want to spray either brake cleaner, carb cleaner, and a combination of compressed air after that in all of these little holes, and make sure they come out somewhere. If you spray something in, it should come out in a certain passage. Some of them are connected to the low and high speed screws, so you might not see them until you take those out. If you're going to take these out, guys, I always recommend doing this. Take them out one at a time. Take the low speed out, spray carb cleaner, brake clean, compressed air through that passageway, and then do the high speed because you don't want to mix up the screws. I'm not sure if they're identical or not, but I always don't take the risk, so I just take them out individually, and that's always worked well for me. So keep all these passageways clean. Make sure that the float is operating, picking up the needle. You can check the setting on it if you have a Walbro or a what's the other type of carburetor, Zama, and might be some other ones too, but those are the two common ones, Walbro and Zama carburetors. You'll see that a lot on a piece of equipment. So that's for this side. Just make sure all the holes, something comes out of the other side and you don't see any visible gunk, varnish, dirt, etc. And then you can go ahead and put this side back together, and we'll go to the other side and I'll show you guys what to do and look for. Side of the carburetor taken apart. What you'll see here on the top is the idle speed screw, and all the idle speed screw is a tapered piece that opens up the throttle butterfly ever so slightly, and it increases the idle speed. So that you don't touch until you're actually getting everything tuned in and you want to set the final idle speed, making sure that obviously if it's chainsaw, the chain's not rotating at idle. Usually a line trimmer, you don't want it rotating at idle either. So that's kind of what I do. You can set them with a tachometer. There might be a specification in a manual that you can find, but that's just all it does is it pushes against the butterfly and opens it or closes it ever so slightly, and that is that. So right in the center, I guess off center, is the screen right there. That's the inlet screen. And sometimes when you run really bad fuel and say the fuel filter was off in the tank, or somehow the fuel filter was extremely dirty or letting dirty stuff from the tank get past the filter, it ends up right in that screen, and it could clog up that screen, and then it won't let any fuel to the other side of the carburetor, and the machine probably won't run at all. You can take these screens out. They just kind of pop out with a little pick. You can just pull them right out. You can take the screen completely out and run it without a screen. You can buy a new screen, or you can try to clean out the one you already have with some carb cleaner, compressed air, stuff like that. Once again, the same thing on this side. Try to get all of these holes, spray through them, get them clean, maybe some compressed air to finish it off, and put it back together the exact same way you found it. Make sure those flapper valves right there aren't sticking up at all. Try to make sure they're straight across and level, because that kind of plays an important role in how the engine runs as well. So if they're all bent and worn out, stiff, it might be time for a new diaphragm kit for the carburetor. And like I said, if you're doing it for a customer, I would just suggest buying an entire carburetor, because this is one of the knockoff carburetors you can buy on eBay. This is not a Zama or a Walbro. It's a Chinese knockoff. They're about $12, I think. But they work the exact same. They're exact replicas of the OEM manufacturer carburetors. So all the stuff I'm telling you is exactly what you're going to see on a Walbro or a Zama, the bigger name carburetors like that. So make sure you guys got that screen clear. The holes here, low and high speed screws, take them out individually, spray through them, preset them, but kind of count the number of turns in before you take them out, just so you have a reference of where it was at. Usually I'll put them both at 1 turn out, or 1 and 1.5 on the high speed, just because that's kind of a general rule of thumb, and it should start and run with those settings. You can always back out the low speed if it's bogging and not accelerating very good. You could always give it just a tick more fuel. And like I said, using a tachometer is always best for getting the proper idle RPM and the proper wide open throttle RPM. But that's basically it for these carburetors, guys. A lot of times the primer bulb will crack if it's really old, it's been sitting for a long time. You may have to replace the primer bulb. It's very simple. They usually come with a new primer bulb if you get a new carburetor. You can probably buy 10 of them for $2, I would guess, online. I see that quite often, and then obviously it'll take 100 pulls because you can't prime any of the fuel. Getting from the tank to the carburetor, that's what the purge bulb does. It's actually called a purge bulb, not a primer bulb. So it doesn't actually put fuel in the intake or the throat of the carburetor at all. It just kind of purges all the air out of the system and gets fuel up to the carburetor so that it doesn't take you 20 pulls to pull fuel up. It takes 2 or 3 pulls. That's what the purge bulb is designed to do. So a lot of times they crack, especially the ones that are not attached to the carburetor. You'll see that you'll push them once, all of a sudden it's got a huge split down the middle. It's junk, you got to replace it. So be on the lookout for that. If you're working on something that's been sitting for a while, always check that primer purge bulb, I guess you'd call it. Make sure it's in good condition. Very cheap to replace that if you have to. This carburetor is pretty simple job. If you have any questions, make sure you leave a comment down below. Be more than happy to answer any questions on them. But like I said, sometimes it's even cheaper just to get a whole new one because they're like $12. But if you're ambitious and want to clean one out, pretty simple. Just kind of follow what I told you and you should be good to go.